Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now, as always, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by our friends at ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA is the membership body for academics, artists and people who are just interested in animal issues. I'm a member of ASA. You should be a member of ASA too. Now, not only is ASA supporting this episode of Knowing Animals, but it's actually being recorded at the ASA conference, the ASA 2017 conference, which is being held at the University of Adelaide. And I'm really lucky to be joined by one of our conference hosts today. So I'm joined by Professor Rachel Ankeny. Did I get that right?
Yes, that's right.
From the Department of History at the University of Adelaide. And today we're going to have a talk about Rachel's journal article, which she co-authored with Heather Bray, and it's called Happy Chickens Lay Tastier Eggs, Motivations for Buying Free-Range Eggs in Australia. And it was published in Anthrozoos in May 2017, so it's just out. Welcome to the podcast, Rachel.
Thank you for having me on.
So, Rachel, can you start by telling us what led you to write this piece of work?
So, Heather and I have been doing a whole range of studies looking at various ethical issues with regard to food, and in particular focused on the kinds of choices people make or want to make that they think supports their own ethical values. We try not to prejudge what counts as an ethical value, but people come up with all sorts of types of reasons, including wanting to support the local economy, wanting to be more sustainable with regard to purchasing, consumption, and waste, avoiding GM perhaps, favoring organic perhaps. So there's a whole range of different kinds of values. In the context of that, then, we were interested in why people make decisions, particularly about meat products was a sub-theme, and it's part of a different project as well. And we found that people weren't that comfortable talking about meat, which is a different story. Even if they did, in fact, eat meat, they wanted to talk about eggs. So we, in a sense, started really tracking the dialogue that arose in our qualitative research surrounding eggs.
And do you have a theory as to why eggs is something that people are happy to talk about?
I think eggs are in some way perhaps more approachable because they're so ubiquitous. Most people, eat them unless they're vegans. Second, I think there has been a huge push on the part of retailers to really bring free-range eggs in particular, into vision. And so across, and we found it quite robust across gender, age, but also different demographics, socioeconomic, eggs are at a price point where people, even with very limited resources, can think about buying what are labeled as free range. So I think in that way, there's just a wider discussion perhaps, or at least a wider awareness about free range eggs in particular.
So they're a point at which more people can feel as though they're doing the right thing, perhaps.
Yeah, correct. So I think, and we did find that. So our research is largely qualitative. We have focus groups, but we also do what we call interviews, sort of shopping mall intercepts, so that we can widen kind of the group that we actually are interviewing. And people said exactly that, which was quite interesting, that they'd love to be able to buy, for example, free-range meat, but it's just too expensive. The price point is just too different than the conventional, whereas the price point was perceived by many people as being within range so that they could still afford it. And particularly, for lack of a better word, the cheaper end of the free-range kind of branding.
Interesting. So in the paper, you use an expression that I've not seen before, which is ethicvocual. I probably completely butchered that. ETHICVOUOLUAL, food consumption. Do you remember that? It was kind of
No.
a catch-all phrase to describe a whole range of different ethically inspired food consumption. Well, despite that, can you tell us what are the trends in ethical food consumption? Why is it popular? What does it encompass?
Yeah. I mean, and again, I think there's a lot of attention to these things in the media and in retailing and so on and so on. And in that way, it raises people's attention. And I think even in very popular media, tonight, Jamie Oliver's everywhere talking about what are ethical food choices. So it's clear that those kind of media pushes have increased awareness, if not about the kinds of choices you can make, certainly about that language associated with ethical consumption. Second, there's been a lot of debates over labeling and what labels can tell you and what they can't tell you, how limited they are, particularly here in Australia. So I think the term that you were talking about makes reference to this idea of sort of being an ethical eater, much like a locavore, someone who's a local eater. But what we really find then is that people have different things that they emphasize. So in many cases, it's very difficult, depending on the product, to fulfill all your values with one product. So a good example, although fair trade is an increasing kind of branding, particularly in Britain and Europe, it's very difficult to get fair trade branded products here in Australia, except things like coffee and chocolate, a few that you may have seen. So even if someone wants to make sure that this was produced under positive working conditions, fulfilling certain attributes, you're not going to find a product that's labeled that way. Now, I think we assume that working conditions are fairly good here in Australia, though there has been exposés about that. But if you're looking to find, a humanely produced product that's also fair trade, that's also perhaps organic and maybe made locally, it's often very hard to tick all those boxes. So the other trend that we really find is that people, for different products, emphasize different bits of it. Most people, perhaps they might buy a locally roasted coffee, but there isn't locally grown coffee, but they still need their coffee. So, they kind of compromise and try to do what they think is the best that they can do to maximize kind of doing good for others. And I think there is an association, which is another part of the trend, with if you do good for others, it'll be good for you. So sort of it'll be healthier for me, my family, my kids, if in fact what we're eating has been produced well. But what that means differs for different people. Some people say that means not eating any meat products. Some people would say that means not eating any animal products. Others would say, well, as long as it's under what they perceive as being humane conditions, then it's acceptable to do it. But they're going to always eat the humanely produced labeled products.
So one of the things that you identify in the journal article is that for many people, the idea that what the chook consumed then says something about what they're consuming. So if the chook egg is free range, then the hen perhaps had a better diet, which means that you yourself are getting a better diet. Yeah.
So there's lots of associations, I think, particularly about what animals eat and wanting, for example, to avoid feed that is or perceived to be produced using GM, for example. But I think in the case of the free-range chooks, it's also a more general idea that they had a happier life and therefore the eggs actually taste better. Now, we weren't studying that. We don't have empirical evidence whether that's true or not, but there's a conception that in some way, if we return to romantic, idyllic farms of the past, which is what free-range is associated with, the food will taste better. So it's this return to nature talk that we see a lot of, not just with regard to free-range eggs, but across a whole range of products and discussions about why these sorts of production methods are better.
So you don't see the decision to pay more for eggs as saying something about the consumer's desire to support animal welfare?
I think that is one of the values that's in the mix for many consumers. So we didn't do a quantitative study, so we can't give you percentages. But what I think we're trying to say in the paper is that's one of many values. So if, for example, you have a free-range product, you're an egg producer, you can't count on the animal welfare being the main or the sole motivator for purchase. There's all these other values intertwined, and often they may be on a bit of an iffy kind of basis. So things like nutrition, things like flavor, for instance. And there are some limited studies empirically that have been published in the States, and I think there's one in Europe as well, that actually showed in blind tastings the free-range eggs didn't taste as good to people as the non-free range. So there's some things that sort of are a fragile basis probably for support that people also talk about when they talk about free range. I think there's a bit in the paper goes into the idea that the price point is also really significant in that this may become a bit of a symbolic thing. It's the one place where they feel they can actually make a so-called ethical purchase. Everything else is out of their price range. So it's as much about that as any deep understanding of free range tied into certain modes of production that are more humane. Surely, I'm sure among consumers, of course, there are those who are really very knowledgeable about how free range contributes or fails to contribute in some cases to chook welfare. It's just one part, though, of this bigger puzzle.
And so evidence and where consumers get their evidence from or information from is part of what you consider in the article. Are they getting good sources of information?
I think the internet is a mixed blessing, as with everything, right? And in this case, particularly with food consumption decisions, it's no different. People are getting information, for example, from locales other than Australia, which may or may not be applicable here. So one of the things that's really come out as a bit of controversy is how many chickens you can have per hectare to sort of be able to count as free range. What's the limit? And of course, that's a big difference between different lower end brands and higher end brands. Among others, is how many hens there are in a certain space. Those limits, for example, are different in different countries. They're not articulated in all locales. If people just Google something, they may or may not be getting Australia-specific information. So that's one thing we've noticed quite a lot. The second thing, though, is the labels themselves. And there's just been an ACCC investigation and a policy that's been put forward about what needs to be on a label in order to call it free range. And what I think is interesting, people assume, wrongly, that things like FSANs are governing food labeling. And in most cases, though, of these kinds of ethical claims, it's basically a truth in advertising claim. It's about what would you think of when you think of free range, and is this product fulfilling that? And that's why it fell under competition watchdog. And so what they've come out with are some policies governing what needs to be happening in order for a free range label to be used, and signaling that they will prosecute or pursue anybody who doesn't have those conditions that continues to call themselves free range. Many smaller scale egg producers that are making free range claims are unhappy, though, because the limits, how many hens you can have, are actually quite high and much higher than they think you need to have in place to have quote unquote true free range. So there's still a lot of disputes there, and I think for the average consumer, he or she will just see free range on a label and assume, that it is what it is, and that's problematic in lots of cases.
Fascinating. Now, Rachel, I ask everybody who comes on Knowing Animals to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Sure.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Oh, I think Carol Adams, probably. Yeah. One of the
Sexual Politics of
Solid
Meat?
Politics of Meat, which had been renamed in the version I had. But yes, that is the one, yeah.
Wonderful. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
That I ever wrote. So I think a lot of what I do wouldn't be described as pro-animal. We try to really think and listen to what other people are saying and doing. I think indirectly then that makes a contribution to pro-animal stances because it provides good information, and also about the inhibitors for people who aren't actually really considering where animals fit in the picture, trying to get the information out there. So all of our food values scholarship in that way can contribute.
Wonderful. If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Donna Haraway. Sorry, these are going to be boring answers. I think Donna Haraway, particularly because I also come out of a history and philosophy of science background, and Haraway has had huge impacts. I'm also a bioethicist by training, and I think she crosses all of those fields, even when I'm thinking about things in bioethics like status of disabled newborns or other things. And particularly because I remember when I read it in graduate school, it was very jarring. It was very different than anything I had read at that point. So that would have been Simians and Cyborgs. And it sort of woke me up to this other way of thinking about things.
Wonderful. So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
I think is to be careful not to overblow activist positions, but to really help people think critically. I think that's essential. Too often, I think the public gets turned off if we go too far towards an activist position. Lots of people have activist positions that are, well-grounded. But as scholars, it's really important to help people get good information, think critically, and rethink their own positions. I think that's essential.
Wonderful. So if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
That's a hard one. You didn't warn me about this. I think if I had the power to change one thing, it would be for people to think harder about their relationships with domestic animals. I know that's going to sound a little bit funny. We look at agriculture a lot, but I think too often we think domestic animals are the basis of how we should understand everything else, and that creates all sorts of fallacies. So the chooks come to mind. That's why I brought this up, that we get a lot of people telling us, I know all about chooks because I've got them in my backyard. And yes, they're laying eggs, and yes, they're eating the garbage, but that still makes them more or less a domestic, a pet. And I think that then conflates for people kind of other values. So I think people, oddly enough, need to think about those relationships closest to home.
Mm-hmm. So Rachel, what are you working on next?
So at the moment we're working on a range of projects, but one that's relevant is looking at people's attitudes and ideas, particularly towards red meat consumption. I know a lot of animal studies scholars are just simply opposed to those kinds of industries, but I think it's critical to work with them to figure out kind of best practices, but also understand where the public is coming from at this moment in time. There may be long-scale changes we want to make, but we're in this moment now. And then I've got a completely different project, which comes out of my history and philosophy of science background, looking at the way in which scientists are working with organisms in contemporary biology. And so that ranges across fields like genomics and genetics, but also ecology, environmental studies, and so on, and getting people to talk about their relationships with those animals, why they ask the kinds of scientific questions they do using those animals, and more broadly, in a sense, where are organisms headed as models for human systems and other systems.
Wonderful. So how can people find out more about your work?
So my name is very unusual. You can just Google. My surname is Ankeny, and look for the Food Values Research Group on the University of Adelaide webpage.
Rachel, thank you so much for joining us at Knowing Animals, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or you can follow me at SO_S. You can also find us on Facebook, and don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. iTunes reviews mean a lot in terms of recognition and availability of the podcast. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.